Power beyond belief. Luxury beyond imagination. Mummies beyond description. Riches beyond fabulous. Welcome to the afterlife, ancient Chinese style. Enter the secret, splendid, tragic world of China's megatombs. Man-made mountains that once proclaimed the might of emperors and brought dynasties to their knees. China, Shaanxi Province. Hundreds of earthen mounds rising above the farmlands near Xi'an. Some merely large, others gigantic. What's buried inside them is mostly unknown. But who's inside isn't any mystery. These are the tombs of emperors, generals, lords and ladies, some of the richest and most powerful people who ever lived on Earth. "2,000 years ago, these peaceful farmlands ran with blood as armies clashed and dynasties rose and fell. They rang with music and laughter as China's nobility reveled in all life's pleasures. And they echoed with the sounds of toil as thousands of workers built massive pyramid tombs, monuments of a splendid world even death couldn't end.
These tombs were symbols of power, they were symbols of wealth, they were symbols of political legitimacy. They said everything about how a person lived in their lifetime. They said it for eternity. To put it simply, we could say, I've got the biggest tomb, I'm the best.
It's a rare event when archaeologists open one of these mega tombs, giving experts like architectural historian Tonja Eckfeldt a look inside. So many mysteries still lie beneath the earth. But one thing is clear. Centuries ago, building these tombs was a mega challenge. To satisfy their emperors, engineers had to move millions of tons of earth, dig huge holes dozens of meters deep, and cover them with man-made mountains. How did they do it? The year is 246 BC. China doesn't exist. Instead, 7 small kingdoms fight each other for supremacy. In one of them, called Qin, a new king has just inherited the throne. He's only 13 years old. But one of his first acts as king is to order the construction of his tomb. To us, 13 might seem a little young to be worrying about death. But as archaeologist Charles Higham points out, 2,000 years ago, 13 was a lot older than it is today.
Who can tell how long he would live? Some people were dying in their 20s or 30s, and therefore it was vital for him to ensure his immortality immediately.
For the royal tomb builders, success or failure depended on getting one thing right: location. In ancient China, important tombs had to be built on higher ground, and a king's tomb had to be the highest of all. But building on high ground was no guarantee of success, unless workers could easily dig it dozens of meters deep. The tomb builders picked a site 89 kilometers from the royal capital, on the slopes of a mountain called Mount Li. What they probably didn't know was that the tomb they were about to build would be one of the greatest tombs ever built on Earth. Because the boy king of Qin didn't go to an early grave. He grew up to do something no Chinese ruler had ever done. He crushed his rivals in a series of brutal wars and unified their kingdoms into a single empire under his command, the Empire of Qin. In English, China. By 221 BC, he was the most powerful man in his world. And he knew it. He renamed himself Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor of China. And he wanted a tomb that would leave no doubt about who he was and what he had done.
What better way to project your limitless power than to have the biggest mausoleum, the biggest pyramid ever built?
For his tomb builders, the first emperor's triumph was one of history's biggest game changers. Now, they couldn't just build a tomb that was fit for a king. They had to build a monument to the most powerful man in China's history. Luckily, they were already working from a brilliant blueprint. A tomb that centuries later would astonish its discoverers. 1977. Chinese archaeologists excavate the tomb of an aristocrat named Zhang Houyi, who died some 200 years before the first emperor. It was a tomb unlike any ever found in China. Earlier Chinese tombs had been simple vertical shafts. But Zhang Houyi's tomb was an underground palace, divided into chambers with holes in their walls and the coffin, so that his soul could roam at will through his eternal mansion.
200 years before the first emperor's tomb, we have a whole new concept, and that concept is this: that you don't just have a tomb, you have a palace, an underground set of chambers, each one to its own purpose, within which the dead would live in perpetuity.
These great and powerful men would live on after death, and their tombs would need to satisfy all their requirements.
Zhang Houyi's afterlife required a complete orchestra and almost 10 tons of exquisite bronze serving vessels.
The bronze serving vessels, the wine vessels, the food vessels in this particular tomb are, at least in my view, some of the most, if not the most, spectacular bronze castings ever to come from the ancient world.
But fine music and fine food weren't all that kept Zhang Houyi eternally happy. Archaeologists found the skeletons of 8 young women in his tomb. Concubines, slain at his death to keep their master company for eternity. Some 2 centuries after the death of Zhang Huoyi, engineers began building the first emperor's tomb. China's greatest underground palace. A man-made mountain some 350 meters on each side, between 50 and 70 meters high, and made from more than 3.5 million tons of earth. And it was more than just a tomb. It was nearly 6,000 hectares, one of the largest mortuary complexes anywhere on Earth. The tomb's never been excavated, but ancient accounts give an unforgettable description of the burial chamber. Its roof shining with heavenly constellations. Its floor recreating the emperor's realm with flowing rivers and oceans made of mercury. And replicas of all his palaces waiting to welcome his soul. Surrounded by everything he would need to rule for eternity as he had on Earth. Everything. The ancient accounts don't even mention what his tomb builders tucked away in 3 obscure pits in one corner of the tomb. An army of clay, 8,000 strong, the now famous terracotta warriors. Nearby pits held other magnificent statues of jugglers, acrobats, officials, and chariots, and horses attended by their grooms. The emperor's world modeled in bronze and clay. And a break from a very dark tradition. Before the first emperor, Chinese rulers sacrificed real people to serve them in death. But the number of human lives needed to equip this tomb for the afterlife would have been too awful to contemplate.
By the time of the first emperor, it was clear that you couldn't literally slay an entire regiment of an army, but replicas were perfectly satisfactory.
But concubines were different. Ancient records claim that the first emperor took all his childless concubines with him to the grave. But are those ancient records true? In 2005, a team of archaeologists found evidence they might be. They discovered the outlines of a huge 80 by 50 meter chamber inside the mound, surrounded by a stone wall nearly 150 meters long and 125 meters wide. They also discovered high concentrations of mercury in the surrounding soil. A huge burial chamber and high concentrations of mercury hint that tales of underground rivers and seas of mercury and stories of sacrificed concubines might be true. But there's another incredible story about this tomb. A story that's created a mystery. A mystery that remains unsolved to this day. Ancient records say that when the first emperor's tomb was finished, it was 115 meters high, twice as tall as it is today. At that height, its base would have been 500 meters on each side, making the tomb 5 times bigger than it is today, and 4 times bigger than Egypt's Great Pyramid. If it was so much bigger, why is it so much smaller today? Many experts believe that 2,000 years of wind and rain have eroded the tomb's enormous dirt mound. But there's another theory. Some believe the tomb's too low because it was never finished. Why would the most powerful man in China spend years building himself an incredible tomb and then not finish it? in this pomegranate orchard near the tomb. Archaeologist Zhang Zhongli may have found the answer.
There are huge numbers of bones here. This one is either a thigh or a shin. There is a scalp over here. You can even see teeth here. So the body lies this way.
The first emperor's tomb wasn't just built with tons of cheap dirt. It was also built with thousands of cheap human lives.
We cannot tell how many skeletons are here. They're all mixed together. I think there's one here and another over here. The bodies are not placed in any order. This is a group tomb.
Who were these people? Their modern portraits are nearby. When he unified all of China, the first emperor acquired the biggest labor force in Chinese history. A force he conscripted to build his mega tomb. Today, visitors to the tomb site see those workers depicted as heroes. But their bones tell a very different story.
Look at this skull. From the teeth, we know that this person was only around 30 years old. But he died because of intense work and difficult working conditions.
Even for strong young men in the prime of life, building the first emperor's tomb was a living hell. Tomb workers labored from dawn to dusk, worked to exhaustion, deprived of food and sleep. Thousands succumbed to miserable deaths.
After any worker died, his body was thrown in a burial ground rather than in a personal grave. The bones were piled up more than 10 centimeters high.
The first emperor's tomb is entirely impressive. It's wonderful, it's innovative, it's inspirational. The tomb is also shocking because of the human suffering it caused.
The tomb's horrific toll in human labor wasn't its only cost. No Chinese ruler had ever spent so much money on his tomb. In the end, the price was too high. The first emperor died in 210 BC. The next year, China's exhausted people rose in revolt. 3 years later, his successor was murdered, and his dynasty ended after only 15 years. In the chaos that followed the emperor's death, his tomb may never have been finished. And that might explain why it isn't as tall as it's supposed to be. The tomb built to proclaim an omnipotent dynasty helped destroy it in a single lifetime. But the first emperor's great achievement, a unified China, never fell apart.